Hi, good morning, everyone. I see our attendees are rolling in here. We'll just give another minute or two for everyone to join. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the State Water Board staff workshop on possible alternative approaches to address water supply shortages in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta watershed. My name is Molly Williams. I'm an environmental scientist in the State Water Board's Office of Public Participation, and I'll be facilitating our workshop today. During the workshop, staff from the State Water Board's Division of Water Rights will describe and receive public input on possible alternative approaches to address water supply shortages in the Delta watershed, including, but not limited to, a curtailment methodology similar to Standard Water Right Term 91. Prior to today's workshop, staff released a notice and technical document describing the topics that will be covered today. These documents are posted on the Delta Drought webpage at waterboards.ca.gov/drought/delta. Okay, next slide, please. And before we get started, we'd like to go over just a couple logistics. First, this workshop is being recorded and is being streamed via webcast on the Cal EPA website at video.calepa.ca.gov. A recording of it will be posted on the Delta Drought webpage as soon as possible after we wrap up today. And in order to successfully manage today's workshop, we've asked all speakers to submit a virtual speaker card in advance. If you've already submitted your virtual speaker card, you should be in the Zoom meeting here using the meeting ID and password provided to you via email. If you submitted a virtual speaker card, but you've not received Zoom meeting information, please email bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. Just the email address right here on the slide. If you have not submitted a virtual speaker card, but would like to make a comment or ask a question today, please submit a virtual speaker card now using the online form provided in the notice for the workshop. And this can be found on our Delta Drought webpage or by emailing bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. And today's workshop will consist of two parts. First, we'll have a staff presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for presentations and comments and questions from the public and other agencies. Following our staff presentation, we'll hear two additional presentations from the public and other agencies, then provide the opportunity for public comment by others who submitted a virtual speaker card. We currently have around 15 individuals who are planning to speak today. And as we approach noon, we'll find an appropriate point to pause and take a lunch break. And during the public input part of our workshop, panel presentations will be limited to 20 minutes. And as we move through these presentations, I'll put a list of the next presenters in the chat, and we'll let speakers know when they have 5, 2, and 1 minute left. Other public comments should be limited to 5 minutes. And I'd like to remind everybody today that oral comments should be technical in nature and address the topics identified in the workshop notice directly. Staff will also be taking note and may respond to any clarifying questions that you may have, so please include those questions if you have them during your speaking time. And again, if you would like to provide more detailed written technical comments, as always, you can email bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. Okay, well, I'll now turn it over to Diane Riddle to introduce the staff presentation.
Thank you, Molly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Again, I'm Diane Riddle. I'm one of the Assistant Deputy Directors in the Division of Water Rights with the State Water Board. And I will, next slide, please. So I'll start with the agenda today. This slide shows a general agenda for the workshop. I'll start with some background relevant to today's workshop and an overview of what we plan to discuss. I'll then turn it over to Matt Holland and Jeff Laird. Matt and Jeff will focus on providing specific context on a possible Term 91 type curtailment method consistent with the document that was released on December 10th on this topic. Their presentation will include background on the existing Term 91 method that is currently included in more junior water rights and possible ways to extend that methodology to more senior water right holders, which is the subject of this workshop. We will then move into public comments and presentations. Next slide, please. So the State Water Board issued the notice for this workshop on November 18th. The general purpose of the workshop is to receive public input to inform future drought response actions in the Delta watershed and concepts or areas that the board should be focusing on if conditions remain dry. While staff is providing an overview of a possible Term 91 type curtailment method today, staff is not proposing any specific drought response actions at this time, including an emergency curtailment method based on Term 91. If and when any specific actions are proposed, these actions would be specifically identified and there would be additional opportunity for public comment. As Molly indicated, in addition to verbal comments we receive here today, additional written comments can be submitted to our email address at bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. Next slide, please. Now I'll provide a little bit of context for where we've been and where we're going. As drought conditions evolve this spring, various actions have been taken by the administration to respond to those conditions. In April, the governor issued a proclamation to address shortages in supplies, first in the Russian River watershed due to the ongoing drought conditions throughout the state. In May, the governor expanded the emergency proclamation to include the Delta watershed and other areas of the state. The May proclamation found that it was necessary to act expeditiously to mitigate the effects of the drought in the Delta watershed, both to ensure the protection of health and safety and the environment and to prepare for potential future drought conditions. The May proclamation specifically directed the board to consider adopting an emergency regulation to curtail water diversions when water is not available at water right holders' priority of right, or to protect releases of stored water in the Delta watershed. Next slide, please. This slide provides some background on the board's actions to date to address water unavailability consistent with the governor's drought proclamation. Soon after the governor's proclamation in May, State Water Board staff released a draft water unavailability methodology, or methodology for short, to inform when water is unavailable at water right holders and claimants' priority of right. In June, we released an update to the methodology and notices of water unavailability to junior water right holders with post-1914 appropriative permits and licenses in the Delta watershed. In July, we released updates to the methodology, a draft curtailment and reporting regulation that uses the methodology, for public comment. The board also issued additional notices of water unavailability to senior water right holders and claimants. In August, the board adopted the emergency curtailment regulation and issued curtailments to water right holders based on the updated methodology. The regulation will remain in effect for up to 1 year, may be renewed or modified after a year. This workshop will help to inform consideration of possible next steps related to possible modifications or extensions. At least weekly since the curtailments went into effect, staff have been providing updates on the curtailment status of various rights via our website and email updates. Also, since the initial version of the water unavailability methodology was released, updates to the methodology have been made, including most recently in September. A workshop is also held in October to inform possible additional updates. Today, we will continue to receive input on this topic to inform possible actions in 2022 if drought conditions persist. Next slide, please. So the August 3rd board resolution adopting the curtailment regulation directed staff to engage with stakeholders by December 31st of this year to identify other possible approaches that could be developed to address severe water supply shortages and related concerns, including low reservoir storage levels, minimum health and safety needs, and maintaining salinity control in the Delta. The resolution specifically identified evaluation of a curtailment methodology similar to standard water right term 91 that is currently included in some water rights in the watershed. Consistent with the direction in the resolution, staff provided notice of this workshop and identified the topics identified on the slide for discussion, including the possible development and implementation of a term 91 curtailment methodology to address shortages. Again, a short report providing background and context for this discussion was released on December 10th. Again, this is not a recommendation at this point. It's just a document to help to facilitate a discussion on this topic, given that it is a complex topic and does require some familiarity with the subject to, I think, track it. The workshop notice also invited input on other near-term possible curtailment methods or other actions that the board should be considering if conditions remain dry. And lastly, the workshop notice requested input on possible methods for determining shortages to riparian water right claimants in the event that natural supplies are inadequate to meet all riparian demands, and correlative sharing of available supplies should occur. The current water unavailability methodology does not yet address this issue, and staff have not proposed any specific methods at this point, but are looking for input on methods that could be considered. With that background, I'll now turn it over to Matt, who will provide additional information regarding the hydrologic context for today's workshop.
Thank you, Diane. My name is Matt Holland. I'm a program manager in the Division of Water Rights, and I'm going to provide a little additional hydrologic context to help understand why a methodology related to Term 91 or other modifications to the existing water unavailability methodology may warrant further consideration. So we've all heard a lot of statistics about how remarkable this drought has been. So I'm going to focus on the facts that motivate consideration of the issues raised in the remainder of the staff presentation. First of all, as we've heard many times, 2020 and 2021 have been the driest 2 years on record statewide. This has led to low project reservoir storage, low reservoir storage in general, but we're going to focus on project reservoirs in this presentation, and substantial uncertainty regarding the degree to which reservoirs will refill. And this substantial uncertainty remains in light of the substantial precipitation event we had in October and the event that we're experiencing now. So over the next 3 slides, I'm going to walk through these the 3 major North of Delta project reservoirs and in the context of storage over the last 2 years. Next slide, please. So first of all, Shasta Reservoir is in the worst shape of the these three project reservoirs relative to its total capacity. It would need to store over 1 million acre-feet between now and April to match its peak storage last year. And that was well below capacity and presented major challenges for managing through the dry season. And just for context here, if we look back at water year 2020, Shasta peaked around 3.8 million acre-feet, and we're seeing, we saw last year a peak around 2.4 million acre-feet. So Shasta would really need to store a substantial quantity of water to even reach the dismal circumstance that we were in last year. Next slide, please. Similarly, Oroville remains well below capacity. It benefited substantially more from the October storm, but would need to store 400,000 acre feet over the next few months to reach its peak storage from last year, and 1.4 million acre feet over that same period to reach the peak storage that it saw in 2020. Next slide. So next we have, and finally, we have Folsom Reservoir, which is doing a little bit better than it was at this time last year. And, given the specific circumstances of the size of the reservoir relative to its watershed, it stands the best chance of refilling over the next several months. However, given that it is a smaller reservoir, there are limits to how much capacity it can provide for tuning the system. And that kind of comes to the key reason that we're considering the storage in these three reservoirs. Collectively, these three reservoirs provide the storage that's used to tune the Delta watershed and ensure that in-basin uses of water and water quality requirements are met when natural flows are insufficient to meet them. In the event that the collective storage of these three reservoirs doesn't recover adequately, the project's ability to provide this tuning of the system is going to be limited, and curtailment approaches that protect the natural and abandoned flows that contribute to meeting water quality may be needed. So next, I'm going to briefly summarize some relevant features of the existing unavailability methodology and Term 91. Next slide, please. Okay, so the existing water unavailability methodology is fundamentally based on a comparison of historical reported demand or diversions, historical reported diversions, which are representing demand, and forecast supply. It operates at a watershed and sub-watershed scales. So it can determine that there's water unavailable at the whole scale of the Sacramento watershed or the San Joaquin watershed, as well as at headwater sub-watershed scales. It does not explicitly consider previously stored water. Next slide, please. Now, Term 91 is another existing part of the water right priority system implementation in the Delta watershed. It's based on real-time data on project storage and releases that are project storage releases in satisfaction of water quality standards in the Delta. It applies to a small number of junior water rights, and it operates at the watershed scale. Next slide, please. So if we were to develop an extension of the Term 91 approach to a broader range of water right priorities, it would differ from the existing methodology in some key ways. The first key feature is that it would be focused on overall water unavailability at the Delta watershed scale and would not address water unavailability at the sub-watershed scales. It would be designed to protect natural flow and abandoned flows from diversions when those flows are needed to meet water quality and flow requirements. And it would be based on real-time calculations from measured data. And thus it would be not quite as reliant on reported water user demand data or projections of natural flows or estimates of abandoned and return flows. And I want to just kind of circle back to that point that I made regarding the collective storage of the project reservoirs. In the event that those project reservoirs are unable to provide storage releases sufficient to meet water quality and flow requirements in the Delta, a method that protects the natural and abandoned flows that are contributing to meeting those requirements may be needed. And that would be a key feature of a Term 91 type approach. With that, I am going to hand off to Jeff Laird, provided that he is able to present. Sorry, we're having some, yes, okay, we have Jeff.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Oh, thank you for going to the next slide. My name is Jeff Laird, and I'm a water resource control engineer in the Division of Water Rights, and I'll give an overview about Standard Water Right Term 91 as it exists currently. Term 91 is a curtailment mechanism included in post-1914 appropriative water right permits and licenses in the Delta watershed with a priority date of 1965 or later. It's in a total of about 115 rights, and its purpose is to ensure that water released and used by the projects is not diverted so as to protect previously stored project water, and to prevent water users from diverting natural flows contributing to delta flow and water quality requirements. Term 91 comes into effect when water is being released from project storage to maintain delta outflow or water quality requirements as defined by State Water Board Decision 1641. And we call this additional water from storage supplemental project water, or SPW. The formula you see up on the screen here is used to calculate supplemental project water. And the components of the equation are as follows. Stored water releases are withdrawals from project storage, such as Shasta, Oroville, or Folsom, and imports from the Trinity River. Exports are defined as diversions out to the California Aqueduct, the Delta Mendota Canal, the Contra Costa Canal, and the North Bay Aqueduct supplied by project water. Carriage water is water required to repel seawater due to export pump operations. According to the method of calculating SPW in order 81-15, carriage water doesn't apply. That means it's 0 in this equation when a flow objective is the controlling objective in the delta, which is most of the time. So SPW is calculated daily by reclamation using the formula shown here and posted on the CVP operations website. And in short, the equation can be described as so. So supplemental project water is equal to the water released from project storage minus exports from the delta minus the carriage water released from project storage. Carriage water minus carriage water flows required to repel seawater due to pump operations. And the current SPW calculation does not account for in-basin deliveries of project water. Next slide, please. In addition to supplemental project water, another criterion for the imposition of Term 91 curtailments is for the delta to be in balanced conditions as determined by the projects. When the delta watershed is in balanced conditions, that means upstream releases and natural flows equal the water needed to meet in-basin uses of water, delta outflow, and project exports. Otherwise, the delta is considered to be in excess, defined as when upstream releases and natural flows exceed the water needed to meet in-basin uses, delta outflow requirements, and project exports. This provision prevents Term 91 curtailments when flood control releases are being made, which can yield a positive supplemental project water under the equation described above. Next slide, please. Thanks. This bar graph, the bar graphs depicted on this slide show the SPW calculation graphically and also show the two elements of the overall water balance of the watershed that are implicit in the calculation of SPW. The bar on the left represents the two major sources of water present in the watershed, natural and abandoned flow, and releases of stored or imported water. The bar on the right represents where water from the sources on the left is ultimately going. That is to the satisfaction of in-basin entitlements, including flow needed to meet water quality requirements of the delta, as well as carriage water and exports. The left and the right bars are equal in height when the watershed is in balance. That is, sources of the flow equal the flow needed to meet in-basin entitlements, carriage water, and exports. If storage releases exceed the sum of exports and carriage water, this difference represents the quantity of SPW being provided by the projects. Next slide. So now I'll talk about, or I'll start to get into adding an additional term to account for missing components of SPW. Using term 91 as a framework for other curtailment approaches could allow the board to account for project deliveries and protect the abandoned and natural flows that contribute to flow and water quality requirements in the Delta. In order to extend a term 91 type approach to more senior water right holders, modifications would be needed to the existing term 91 calculation in order to account for the project's obligation to serve their in-basin contracts with stored water. To do this, another term needs to be added to the equation above to deduct in-basin obligations, that is IO, from the SPW calculation. The IO term represents total in-basin contract deliveries of stored water to contractors ranging in water right priority from no underlying right, that is SWP Table A or CVP service contractors, up to the most senior settlement contractors curtailed at a given time. In the supplemental project water calculation, the in-basin obligation term would be subtracted from the stored water releases along with exports and carriage water. Again, that IO term is the project water delivered to settlement and service contractors. In this equation, when SPW is 0 or negative, project storage releases are only being used for exports, carriage water associated with exports, and in-basin obligations. When SPW is positive, that means that other diverters in the system are diverting previously stored project water or natural and abandoned flows, both of which are needed to meet Delta water quality requirements and senior in-basin entitlements, indicating a possible need for other water users to be curtailed to a level that eliminates SPW. So let's explore this IO term in a little more depth. The projects have two general types of in-basin contractors: CVP service contractors and SWP, that is State Water Project, Table A contractors. I'm sorry. So let me go back a little bit. SWP Table A contractors and CVP service contractors are contractors that do not have their own water rights. Settlement type contractors are contractors of the SWP and CVP that hold their own water right claims, their own water rights and claims of right that also receive supplemental supplies from the projects when water is not available under their own rights. For contractors with no independent water rights, all deliveries would be part of in-basin obligations. For contractors with their own water rights or claims of right, only deliveries of water under the project's water rights, that is water released from storage in project reservoirs, would be part of the in-basin obligation amount. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Matt for more discussions on this term.
Thank you, Jeff. Sorry, I'm catching up with myself here. Bear with me. So we saw this diagram previously. Jeff showed you this diagram, and so that I wanted to return to it just so that to set up further discussion of how an expanded term 91 type curtailment methodology would work. So recall that this is a graphical depiction of the equation at the right, where supplemental project water being provided by the projects to meet in-basin entitlements, including water quality, is the is the portion of storage releases that exceed the sum of carriage water and exports. So in the next slide, we're going to take a look at how that would look in an expanded methodology. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we've just taken that previous graph and we've added the in-basin obligations term. So this yellow box above exports and carriage water. As Jeff previously described, this in-basin obligation term consists of service contractor deliveries and settlement contractor deliveries. So these are deliveries of project water to service contractors or settlement contractors whose underlying rights have been curtailed. So the way that such a methodology would be implemented is the in-basin obligations would be deducted from supplemental project water, and if supplemental project water remains, which is the case in this graph, further curtailments would be imposed to reduce the magnitude of that supplemental project water. Next slide, please. So as I just alluded to on the previous slide, this in-basin obligation consists of deliveries to contractors who do not have an underlying water right. So all of their supplies are in that in-basin obligations bin. And for contractors with water rights, only deliveries of project water are part of that term. So in this instance, when there is positive supplemental project water relative to the sum of export carriage water and in-basin obligations, additional users would be curtailed. And the idea would be to reduce the magnitude of supplemental project water by moving deliveries into the in-basin obligations bin. There would also be, if there were a curtailment of a non-settlement contractor who had a similar priority to a settlement contractor that was curtailed, what would happen is the supplemental project water would be decreased by an increase in natural and abandoned flow that is no longer being diverted by that other water user. Next slide, please. So this method relies upon real-time data, this method relies on some quantification of those in-basin obligations. And so there are many potential approaches to estimating those in-basin obligations. The ideal source would be real-time data on deliveries of project water. So if we had real-time data that described deliveries to SWP Table A contractors, CVP service contractors, and SWP and CVP settlement contractors, then we could just plug that in to determine those in-basin obligations. That would rely upon the projects being able to determine in real time what water that's being diverted by the settlement contractor is project water. Another approach that we could take is to estimate project water deliveries based on historical data. So this could take advantage of historical data on the quantities of project water delivered to settlement contractors related to inflow conditions at those times, for example. A third approach would be to essentially estimate the quantity of demand at a given priority level that equals the quantity of supplemental project water curtailed to that level, and move those demands that are settlement contractor demands into the project in-basin obligation term. So that's this in-basin obligation data derived from other curtailment status. And then a final approach that we described in the report is to use delta outflow as a proxy for the in-basin obligation term. And so in this case, the actual delta outflow at any given time would be deducted from the storage releases in place of an in-basin obligation term. In the instance that delta outflow was high due to uncontrolled flows, for example, that would lead to negative supplemental project water, and curtailments under this sort of term would not be in effect. In the event that delta outflow was the controlling factor, it could lead to curtailment at varying levels depending upon the availability of natural and abandoned flow to meet that delta outflow. This is definitely an imperfect proxy, but it would be the most straightforward to implement. So we thought it was worth putting out there for consideration. Next slide, please. So the data sources that would be available for estimating the in-basin obligation term include reported, depletions between stream gauges, which are near real time, also imperfect, and they don't necessarily capture which diverter is diverting the water. Reported diversions from contractors, which are time lagged after the delivery period. Demand schedules that are provided to the projects ahead of time. These are provided on a monthly basis, and they're trued up by reported diversions later. And then for a sort of retrospective statistical approach, we could use end of year accounting from prior years and incorporate that into relationships with historical inflow data. Next slide, please. That last slide kind of took for granted that real-time data is not an option at present. The current situation with real-time data is that some diversions to state water project settlement contractors would be available in near real time, but real-time data on Central Valley project settlement contractors is not expected to be available in real time. Next slide. So that really leaves us with these last three options: estimated project water deliveries based on historical data, in-basin obligation data derived from curtailment status, or delta outflow as a proxy. And I believe that is it for the staff presentation. So I'm going to pass it back to Molly. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Okay, so a lot of information there. We're going to take a short 10-minute break to digest all of that before we begin our public presentations and public comment to follow. So right now it's 10:37. We will go ahead and come back at 10:47. Okay, hopefully everybody has made their way back, had some time to process all of the information that we've heard from our staff. And now we're going to transition into presentations from those who have requested to make a PowerPoint presentation at the workshop today. As a reminder, State Water Board staff will be here projecting and advancing the PowerPoint slides during the presentation. So please indicate when we should advance to the next slide. Again, presentations should be limited to 20 minutes, and we will begin with Brett Baker and Dante Nomalini Sr. with the Central Delta Water Agency. And I'll go ahead and allow you to speak here. Okay, should be good to go.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I am going to defer my time to my learned mentor here, Dante, as soon as he gets on.
I think I'm on.
All right, there we go. Let him have it.
All right, this is Dante John Nomalini Sr. I'm with the Central Delta Water Agency with Brett Baker and Dante John Nomalini Jr. First, I appreciate the effort of staff to try and intellectually approach this terrible problem we have with the lack of developed water to meet the needs of the projects and the obligations. The approach, in our view, is to focus on exports rather than try and build off of Term 91. Term 91, in our view, has been applied in a manner that's an abuse of the law and also a favoritism towards exports. The obligations of the projects in Term 91 formulation are basically ignored in many respects. For example, the projects clearly by law have the obligation for salinity control, and salinity control is clearly by law a priority obligation of the projects over exports. Similarly, with the Watershed Protection Act, 11460 of the Water Code, and we'll get to some of these slides, the watershed, people within the watershed who need water have a priority over exports. And what happens with Term 91 is that there is natural flow and other flow in the watershed unrelated to the release of storage from a project reservoir that is available, but it's being precluded both in this analysis and in the application of Term 91 from being available to those within the watershed. And what happens is the Term 91 is used as a basis to determine that there's no unavailable, or there's no available water for appropriation. So appropriative rights are subject to Term 91 when in fact there's water flow available, both coming in from tributaries, but also in the delta where it comes from the west. And because the projects operate against the water quality standard, if the water quality is better or the outflow is better, the project take advantage of that. Anyway, the obligations of the project, in addition to salinity control, they have to mitigate their damages. And the damages are not only the fish and wildlife, but by taking water and storing it in reservoirs in the individual year, if that water is stored during the earlier months of the water year, it deprives downstream people of the benefit of having that additional flow come down. And in particular in the Delta, that flow contributes to the amount of time that the Delta has good water quality. It also deprives the watershed of water that would otherwise be stored naturally in the underground and therefore accrete to the system downstream. And that could occur in prior years with a long-standing impact on the area. There are also the affirmative obligations of the projects for fish and wildlife. State Water Project has the obligation of preserving fish and wildlife. The federal project has the obligations under the CVPIA Improvement Act with regard to fish and other mechanisms. Those are all affirmative obligations that have priority over exports. And therefore, we've recommended, if you go to the second slide, our basic approach is that there needs to be an actual effort to plan ahead for meeting these senior requirements that we think there's been a pattern and practice of ignoring that, both by the Department of Water Resources, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the state board, by allowing the projects to ignore the need to meet their requirements in subsequent years. And that goes to carryover storage. And carryover storage has to be a significant factor in this. Now, for the current year, it appears that the projects are operating to meet D1641 without a temporary urgency change. And that depends on what happens with hydrology, I guess, in the near future. But they're only looking towards the possibility of having to meet water quality standards in the subsequent year, 1 year. What happens if we have similar droughts to that which occurred during the planning for the projects? And that is being ignored and needs to be addressed if we're going to find a solution to this problem. So we are suggesting that there be no export of water, whether it be transfer water or otherwise, until it's determined that it's not needed to meet the obligations, the senior obligations of the projects in the current year. And we would suggest consideration for further years, assuming that some may be dry. Now let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Go to the, yeah. This is the hydrology that the projects were planned on. And it showed that the Sacramento-San Joaquin watershed, with the drought of 29 or 28 through 34, would suffer a shortage of 8,049,000 acre feet without exports. And therefore, the plan was to go to the North Coast, which isn't going to occur apparently. And that analysis at that time showed there was a surplus of water that could be developed in the North Coast watershed of 7,930,000 acre feet per year. Let's go to the next slide. Next one. The plan was to develop 5 million acre feet per year from North Coast that would come into the Delta watershed to meet contract demands and obligations in the watershed. Now, obligations at that time considered for fish and wildlife turned out to be less demanding than what the current demands are for protection of fish and wildlife. But that 5 million acre feet was to be developed by the year 2000. It was not developed. And I won't go into the detail of what occurred, but politics plays a big part in water. And politically, they decided not to go forward with North Coast development. And today, I don't think anybody is considering that. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in the Delta, we have commingled water, which the Delta, as we consider curtailments, has being at the bottom of the system has a different situation than those upstream and outside of the delta and the tidal zone. So we have this, which has been explained before, the problem of commingled water and the burden on the projects not to take it in any way that diminishes water in the delta. And of course, the delta has water all the time. So let's put that aside here. Let's go to the next slide. Next. All right. 11.460 of the Water Code. If you read this, it says the department, and there's code section that says that applies to the Bureau, cannot directly or indirectly deprive the water users and the water needs in the watershed of water. And therefore, there's a priority, which I would classify as not only to the natural flow and abandoned flow in the delta, but also to project water, or what you might want to call project water. We would term that as a recapture from the projects of water that is viewed as being water to which they are entitled over and above their obligations. All right, next slide. This quote from a whole series of consistent testimony with regard to the Bureau of Reclamation capsulizes the intent of 11.460 of the Water Code. And it says the Bureau will not divert from any watershed any water which is needed to satisfy the existing or potential needs within that watershed. For example, no water will be diverted which will be needed for the full development of all of the irrigable lands within the watershed, nor would there be water needed for municipal industrial purposes or future maintenance of fish and wildlife resources. Now that means only truly surplus water can be diverted and exported from the watershed. Now let's go to the next slide. There's a bunch of law that confirms this. And in fact, the state Department of Water Resources report to the legislature included this, and it says, water shall not be diverted from the delta for use elsewhere unless adequate supplies for the delta are first provided. Well, that's part of the delta, but that's also a broad obligation with regard to exports in general. Let's go to the next one. All right, the contracts that the Department of Water Resources have with the North Delta Water Agency clearly confirm this obligation and the priority over all exports of water from the Delta to other areas for any purpose. I think any purpose includes so-called health and safety, which we have problems with the definition of. All right, next slide. This is a case that we litigated where the state board was a party, the water contractors were a party. All the players in the water battle today were parties. And the appellate court decided, and this is the particular part I want you to pay attention to, is the act prohibits project exports from the Delta of water necessary to provide water to which the Delta users are entitled and water which is needed for salinity control and an adequate supply for Delta users. Now, salinity control not only is important for the Delta, but it is the basis for net Delta outflow requirements on the project, and it's being used in the proposed formulation here to be an obligation that can be put on senior water right holders, and even those people who are not senior water right holders who are in the watershed that need water, whether it be fish and wildlife or individuals that need the water. You can't do that. The priority is clear. Now, with regard to exports from the Delta, at times there is water available at the bottom end of the system that is over and above the water quality standards and the explicit salinity control obligations imposed by the State Water Resource Control Board. So the projects export that water. And in a crisis like we've had, there may be reason to export it, but it should not go in a way that is not available to meet the needs in future years. So it should be stored. It is being stored in San Luis. It's stored underground in the water bank. That water should be available to be brought back for the projects to meet their obligations under the water quality standards and their obligations for salinity control. It should not be allowed to be integrated into the export areas. And therefore, we would ask the board to be very careful in allowing the exports to take place. Now, this year, when there was 1,000 cubic feet per second reduction in delta outflow from the standard, and I'm going to give up in a minute, the projects were allowed to export up to 1,500 cubic feet per second and water for the North Bay Aqueduct. Now, as it turned out, they stayed under, I think, the 1,500 cubic feet per second. But the 1,000 cubic feet per second could have easily been met had they not exported 1,000 acre feet. So that should not be allowed. Now, the excuse was they needed it for operation of a single pump by the Bureau. The projects have an intertie, and they are allowed to use joint points of diversion. So if the federal pump can't run, the state pumps can run at diminished rates. And I'm not sure what it is, but years ago, they added extra pumps to the state water project just from the standpoint of an operational flexibility. So I think you can operate the projects without that excuse. And of course, you can use water that's already in the system on the San Joaquin side to go ahead and recirculate it in order to run a pump at a constant rate. The other thing is health and safety. Who is it that is going without water and where? And is it impossible to meet that need from water that's already within the watershed, whether it's being used for swimming pools, golf courses, farmland, whatever? It should not be taken from the watersheds of origin in order to meet that need. It should be, unless it was absolutely impossible, it should be met with local water availability and a better allocation in the areas that are importing water. Lastly, there's a big obligation in terms of mitigation of the impact that's occurring by delivery of water to the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, which introduces significant salinity back into the Delta. And it was intended to be addressed with a drain, a valley drain. And that's not even on the table anymore. Nobody's doing anything to build a drain that connects to the ocean. Anyway, we'll give you some written comments to try and put this in a better context. But again, I appreciate the fact that the staff is struggling with some of the reality that involves the broader obligations of the projects. So thank you. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Dante. Wrapped up 2 minutes to spare. Thank you for all of your input. We have one more presentation. It's going to be on behalf of the South Delta Water Agency. We have Thomas Burke, Dean Ruiz, and John Herrick. So I will go ahead and ask you to unmute yourselves. And we'll get the presentation queued up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, John.
This is John Herrick. I'm Council and General Manager for South Delta Water Agency. With me today are Tom Burke, the agency's engineer, and Dean Reese, co-counsel. I'm going to have Mr. Burke give his PowerPoint presentation first, and then Dean and I will follow up with comments. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Burke.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Molly. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to present our comments on the ongoing process to assess and quantify when water in the Delta becomes unavailable to existing water rights holders. I know the process involves a complex myriad of factors that are not easily quantifiable. I have reviewed the water unavailability methodology report and have some concerns on the direction that the process is taking. Our primary concern is with the simplification of the quantification process to the point where it ignores some of the components of the water budget that may be important in understanding the usability of Delta water for water rights holders, especially during drought conditions. Next slide. Some of the primary issues that we are concerned with are, one, that the existing approach may not be accounting for all of the sources of water in the Delta, and two, the approach ignores the complexity of the hydrodynamics of Delta flow. Appendix D of the report acknowledges the limitations of existing modeling under drought conditions, specifically DSM-2 and its ability to predict salinity levels in the Delta during drought periods. But as an alternative to that numerical modeling approach, Appendix D presents a much more simplified methodology that ignores the complex hydrodynamics in the model. The process appears to be stepping back to a position where we're ignoring in-delta processes that we cannot accurately model. And that's not the direction that we should really be going in. Next slide. Sorry about the transitions. I didn't realize that the template that I was using had built-in transitions. But basically, there are three main concerns that we have over the approach and the justification for that approach that is presented in Appendix D. One is the way the model methodology is formulated is more appropriate to a riverine system rather than an estuarine system. It assumes that water quality is the same everywhere in the Delta at the same time. The analysis also assumes that freshwater components to the water budget are replaced by inflow from Suisun Bay, regardless of where they are within the Delta. It does not account for the temporal or spatial changes of flow and water quality across the Delta as a system. By ignoring mixing, it ignores the fact that much of the water inflow from Suisun Bay also consists of water that flowed out from the Delta in previous tidal cycles. In Table 3 of Appendix D, of the 297 acre-feet of inflow from Suisun Bay, up to 70% of that water could consist of water that flowed out of the Delta in the previous tidal cycle, and that's not being accounted for in their analysis. There's also no accounting for spatial distribution of mixing of Delta water with groundwater, tributary inflow components, and return flow components to the water budget. The final conclusion in Appendix D is that without inflow from project water, the Delta water is not usable for agriculture or municipal uses during critically dry periods. Contrary to that opinion, there are historic data that documents the agricultural use of the water during critically dry periods prior to the state and federal projects. Next slide, please. By evaluating the Delta as a single system with instantaneous flow and outflow and no temporal or spatial mixing, you're treating the Delta as a section of river rather than as a dynamic estuary. This type of approach will miss crucial elements that will control water quality throughout the Delta. Next slide, please. This is just a blow up of the graphic that was on the previous slide that is a little clearer. And as you can see from this graphic, we've created a simplistic type of water balance that would be typically done in a riverine or a estuarine system. On the left, you've got a partial water budget that would be clear and concise in a riverine system, but it's not appropriate to use in an estuarine system where mixing is changing the concept of water flow and the water quality as it moves throughout the Delta process. On the right-hand side, you see the actual water budget is more appropriate to an estuarine system that you would find in the delta. The lack of mixing in tidal return flow with inflow, return flow, and groundwater creates inaccurate representation of what's actually happening in the delta and causes for a simplification of the process that needs to be identified more clearly. Next slide, please. The delta volume analysis in Appendix D looks at gross channel depletions rather than net channel depletions, thus ignoring in-delta return flow, and that would affect the volumetric analysis that they've used in their calculations. The analysis also did not look at groundwater inflow to the delta, which during drought periods could become a much larger component than it is during the average or high flow periods. The volume of fresh water in the delta cannot be evaluated without looking at the mixing of flow from all the different components. Groundwater, tributary inflow, and agricultural and municipal return flow needs to be added to this analysis to see the true volume relationships between each section of the delta. Add to that the essential spatial and temporal mixing of these components, which is the heart of an estuary, and you may see a very different picture than one that's being presented in Appendix D. Much of our analysis and understanding of the delta has come from modeling during average and wet periods. The relationship and relative magnitude of these water budget components during a drought period is much less well known, but we still use them as though it is an average year, which is likely to cause a DSM-2 to overpredict salinity during drought periods, as can be seen in Figure 1 of Appendix D in the methodology report. Next slide, please. One of the basic assumptions made in the methodology report states that the salinity of the water from Suisun Bay will overcome all of the freshwater characteristics of the water that's presently within the delta, and only through augmentation from project water would water be available and usable for agricultural municipal uses. The data on agricultural production collected by the state prior to the implementation of the projects does not show that concept to be true. An example would be the drought years from 1931 through 1943 or 34. Both of these years were considered critically dry years using the San Joaquin River Index. Next slide, please. This is a plot of the San Joaquin River Index from 1906 through 2020. I've indicated on this plot lines showing the demarcation of where critically dry, below normal, above normal, and wet year periods would be. As you can see on the far left side of the plot, you can see red dots indicating those years where we had critically dry periods. That would be 1924, 1931, and 1934. What we wanted to do is take a look at what agricultural production looked like during those periods when we had critically dry year, but yet no augmentation from any kind of state water or federal water projects. Next slide, please. This is a quick plot that I wanted to show that shows the extent of maximum salinity into the delta between 1920 and 1939. What each of these lines represent is how far the maximum salinity extended down into the delta for each of these years. And the key takeaway from this graphic is that the maximum salinity occurred usually in mid to late September. And that shows me that the salinity, as you would assume, through mixing of fresh and salt water within the delta, gradually moves across the delta in the north and south directions. It's not an instantaneous type of change in salinity level as would be implied from the analysis presented in Appendix D. Next slide, please. This is an example of how agricultural production has historically responded to wet and critically dry years. This is a plot of irrigated acreage from the Byron Bethany and Westside irrigation districts from the 1929 through 1941 period. What we have on the plot is the San Joaquin Water Year Index shown as a bar graph going from 1929 through 41. The Water Year Index is shown on the right-hand y-axis scale. And again, like on the previous graph, I've shown the demarcation lines for critically dry, below normal, above normal, and wet years. On top of this Water Year Index plot, I've plotted the irrigated acreage that was collected by the state during those years. And I plotted that as a blue line going across the graph. And on the left-hand y-axis, you can see the irrigated acreage in acres. And what's important to note is as you move across this plot from year to year, it shows that the irrigated acreage decreases occasionally during dry periods, but it doesn't disappear. The agricultural users didn't stop irrigating during those periods, but yet they may have reduced the amount of acreage they're irrigating or changed the timing of their irrigation. But basically, they continue to irrigate through both extreme wet and extreme critically dry periods, showing us that the water available at that time was useful to the irrigators and provided a beneficial use. Next slide, please. In summary, there are four major points that we're really trying to pull out of this whole review. The first one is treating the delta as a river system rather than estuary misrepresents the actual hydrodynamics and water quality conditions that exist during the drought conditions. Second is that the delta agricultural practices have historically worked within the range of high and low water years that occur. In the response to those water year types, they may change crop types, they may change irrigation timing, accepting lower yields in response to the water year type. And responding in this way to water year type is often the norm for agriculture everywhere, especially in the Delta. The water unavailability report, as a third point, makes inaccurate assumptions to when it assumes the water is only usable. It assumes that it's not usable during drought periods and only can be used with project releases. Historic data shows that agriculture continued in the Delta during critically dry years long before the projects were built. The last item that we'd like to discuss is that the term 91 type of curtailment ignores historic water use during drought periods that was in place at the time of the Delta water rights were granted. The term 91 type of approach takes the onus off the projects and puts it on the senior water rights holders in the Delta. Overall, we're asking the board not to discount the fact that senior water rights holder, to not discount the fact that senior water rights holders do get beneficial use out of water during critically dry periods and take that account into the development of a type 91 methodology. And that's all.
Okay, if none of the other presenters have anything to add, we can go ahead and move into our public comment period.
Hello, I think John Herrick's got a few comments to make.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Dante covered a lot of the stuff, so I'll be very brief here, but at best, the state board's efforts should be to protect senior water right holders in times of drought like this. But the approach taken so far is to protect storage for the projects and both project obligations and deliveries. And that's important to note because they're doing that at a time when the projects cannot meet their obligations. As Dante said, the Racanelli decision and Water Code sections 12-200 mandate that no exports can occur unless the in-delta entitlements are provided, salinity control is provided, and a full supply for in-delta needs are met. Now, from that, we have to ask the question, can we export from the Delta from October through September in a drought year if there isn't enough stored water for meeting statutory and regulatory obligations? The answer should be no. And from that, it follows that any exports of water should be stored in a method by which they can then be used to meet the project's obligations. Otherwise, the projects are getting benefits without meeting their obligations. So if the water exported during the year is stored in San Luis Reservoir, it can then be used to meet both San Joaquin River and Delta obligations as it was last year from New Melones, and it would therefore meet the permit conditions that are applied to San Luis Reservoir. Remember, the projects couldn't meet their obligations last year, but exported water, and they might not meet their obligations this water year, but still expect to export water. It's this lack of a long-term multi-drought year planning that has caused the situation we are in, where superior right holders are being told that they will be curtailed so that project storage water can be preserved. We should be adopting methods to result in multi-year drought compliance, which is exactly what the governor's drought proclamation requires. Very briefly, the presentation seems to want to protect Bureau and DWR abandoned flows and protect in-basin contract deliveries while at the same time shutting down other water right holders. This seems a backward approach in that everybody may be entitled to a certain amount of water under their rights, but contract supplies delivered by the Bureau and DWR should not be used as a method of curtailing other water users. I recommend the board staff go back and look at the materials we previously provided, which include Dr. Jerry Orlob's analysis of the water in the system, which was presented in a summary judgment motion in a prior hearing, a prior lawsuit, whereby the Bureau and DWR sought to shut down and get damages from Delta diverters because they were diverting during a drought. With that, I think that's all of our time. I'll leave it, and I thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, John. Dean, would you like to chime in at all before we move on?
No, John and Dante and Tom have covered our position and our points. So thank you for allowing us to have the panel.
Great. Yeah, thank you for all of your work on this presentation. Okay, so with that, we will go ahead and move into our public comment period. Our first speakers are going to be David Guy and Darren Cordova, who will be making their comments and coordination as a panel. So you should go ahead and get a notification to unmute yourself and you can begin.
All right, good morning. Can you hear me, Molly?
Yes, I can. I'm going to go ahead and put the timer up on the screen as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity here. I'm David Guy with the Northern California Water Association, and I'm going to be joined today by Darren Cordova from MBK Engineers, who we work obviously very closely with. We go back to the August 3rd resolution that I think started this conversation from the State Water Board and looking at exploring different approaches that will help the State Water Board work through another dry year in California. We have been working on scenario planning with a broad group of state, federal agencies, local water suppliers throughout the region, and with the goal of preparing better for 2022. And we have support from a strong technical and legal team who are helping to make the water rights system work, I think, in the Sacramento River Basin. As we're sitting here today, we offer a handful of thoughts that we really think the State Water Board will benefit from as it thinks about 2022. To start, we really appreciate the work that the State Water Board has done to implement the water rights priority system this year. That includes the water rights curtailment process and Term 91, the existing Term 91. We have particularly appreciated the nimble approach to both the imposition and the suspension around these curtailments, and using water availability and planning for storm events. And so really appreciate the good work that the State Water Board has done in this spirit. There are 4 ideas that we think are worthy of consideration in 2022 that will build upon, I think, that success and will make the process even more effective. The first is the methodology, obviously, for the water right curtailments. We think that that's on a very positive trajectory, and so we're very encouraged by that. And that's particularly true for direct diversions, but we think that some more work that could be done with respect to storage water rights. And we would love to work with the State Water Board staff and have MBK, Steve Grinnell, and others work with the State Water Board staff to improve that process for storage water rights. The second thing that we think is important is enforcement. We strongly encourage the State Water Board to aggressively pursue enforcement of its curtailment process. The sanctity of the process depends upon it. And in our view, you have a new regulation that was designed in large part to be able to enforce it. And we encourage you to pursue that to the extent you can. And if that requires some budget assistance, we would be more than happy to help with that, whatever that would look like to be able to have the State Water Board be able to do that more effectively. The third is to fully utilize the complaint process. We've appreciated that the State Water Board has a complaint process on its website, and we encourage the State Water Board to make that widely known. Obviously, it's all dependent upon all of us to make the water rights system work in these dry years, and I think making people know that there is that kind of a process and make people accountable for their water rights, we think is very important. There's been also some complaints along the way that we think would be helpful for the Water Board to at least think about. There's been some letters from the state and federal projects, the state water contractors. Not sure quite what the board's approach has been to those complaints, and I think there's been some others as well, but I think the Water Board should at least look at the complaint process in a little bit more detail. The fourth area, we think that there's a very important role for the Administrative Hearings Office. I think several folks have suggested that in some of your earlier workshops. And I think that is a new mechanism that you have at the State Water Board to deal with some of the challenging and vexing issues that have kind of plagued the Bay Delta watershed since 1978. And we think there's some things in the report that was put out in 1978 that might inform that. And I think the folks on this workshop today working together, I think could help maybe frame this for the Administrative Hearing Office in a way that would help resolve some of the complicated issues surrounding this dynamic. So in sum, we believe that these are actions that will help the Water Board administer the water rights system in 2022, which I think was the objective in the board's resolution. And we think that you can do those things without shifting Bay Delta responsibilities, without dividing people in the state at a time when we really should all be working together. The Term 91 approach, as you know, is extremely contentious. It's extremely complicated, and we would welcome additional conversations around that. But to me, it is not something that you can just simply adopt and move forward with for some of the reasons you've already heard, and I think you're going to be hearing a lot more. We think there's a much more productive way that you can move forward in 2022 than a divisive approach, as I think we're all sensing today. So with that, I think Darren Cordova, who we rely upon to really understand and delve into this, I think we'll build on these comments and look forward to hear his thoughts. Thank you.
Darren, you should have permission to speak and we can restart the timer.
Great, thank you. Good morning, my name is Darren Cordova of MBK Engineers, and today I'm substituting in for Mr. Mark Van Camp of our office, who regretfully could not participate today. But we do support the comments provided by Mr. Guy, so thank you, David. And in addition to those comments and in regard to technical matters relative to the administration of the water rights system, we believe it's important to consider the long, detailed history of efforts and analyses undertaken in support of decisions by the State Board. An understanding of those prior efforts will assist in refining an approach to appropriately implement curtailments. For example, relative to the Sacramento River settlement contracts, the 1956 cooperative studies undertaken by the Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Water Resources, and a large group of water users evaluated the available water supply, water rights, and other factors to assist in arriving at the contract quantities within those settlement contracts. The studies relied upon different flows, along with different assumed water right priority dates for a delta salinity control requirement. Those studies were submitted into evidence with the State Board and relied upon for the State Board's decision 990 to form the basis of the Sacramento River settlement contracts. We believe it is imperative that the State Board review those studies and related items before embarking upon an effort that may result in shifting responsibilities to in-basin senior water right holders in order to meet Delta requirements, which would have long-term unintended consequences. In an effort to assist in efficiently navigating through the complex history of those detailed studies and other analyses, the Sacramento River settlement contractors offer assistance to the State Board through technical meetings in order to provide a detailed background and key information relative to the studies, approvals, and accounting of base supply and project water under those settlement contracts. We believe that through collaboration, as David suggested, formulating potential approaches or methods with state board staff are possible. And perhaps as an initial matter, we suggest identifying a date at which written comments may be provided to the state board via the Bay Delta email address mentioned earlier, relative to the documents that were posted for this workshop. I'd say in conclusion, thank you for consideration of these comments. We very much look forward to scheduling technical discussions with state board staff as soon as possible for this collaborative effort. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Darren. Tom Berliner is our next speaker. Tom, you should get a request to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm here today on behalf of the Merced Irrigation District. My comments will be very brief. As you will hear from many speakers, including those that have already spoken, seeking to use Term 91 is incredibly complex and raises many issues that are quite controversial. We are very concerned that the board has been ignoring its recently enacted policy regarding disadvantaged communities, and that persists with what appears to be a blunt instrument application of Term 91 to users beyond those that have historically been affected by Term 91. It also fails to take into account the seniority of water rights. The board is obligated to take into account the seniority of rights and to simply say, well, this watershed can no longer divert, fails to take that into account. Further, there's been no application or effort regarding the recognized theft of water that has been occurring in multiple areas around the state. The board has already been well aware of and has cited the theft of water as being a major impact on the system. In addition, there are gross inefficiencies on various rivers. For instance, on the Merced River, due to inefficiencies by downstream senior right holders, the Merced Irrigation District is impacted to between 40 and 80,000 acre feet a year. That is unnecessary. If efficiencies could be brought to bear on those downstream users, this water could be put to reasonable and beneficial use instead of the inefficient use to which it's put today. Finally, the board appears to be taking a simplistic approach to diversions in the Delta. You've heard a somewhat complex presentation by some of the Delta folks this morning, but in our view, the question is more complex than what they have presented to you. There's the issue of riparian rights versus appropriative rights. We're aware that the Delta Water Master has proposed treating all Delta diversions as being riparian. We strongly disagree. We think the board needs to do an analysis of Delta rights and that it should be looking towards theft, inefficiencies, and appropriative uses in the Delta before it reaches beyond the existing Term 91 to other water users, particularly those with pre-1914 rights. That's my comments. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Jeannie Zalesny.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Jeannie Zalezi, representing Banna Carbona Irrigation District, West Stanislaus Irrigation District, and Patterson Irrigation District. And I'd like to just reiterate some of the comments that have been made that Term 91 is not an appropriate methodology to utilize for dry year curtailments. Term 91 has issues on its own. It was intended to be an interim methodology when it was first adopted. And when the state board staff determined at that time that it would be too difficult to come up with a better method, it recommended that Term 91 would be used on a permanent basis. For the same reasons that it has complications, it's not appropriate to use it at this point. In addition, imposing Term 91 on all water right holders in the Delta watershed would raise the same issues that the court found wanting in Term 91 in El Dorado Irrigation District versus State Water Resources Control Board in 2006. Specifically there, the court condemned the state board's use of Term 91. The state board had asserted that the inclusion of Term 91 in El Dorado's permit was a proper exercise of discretion because, quote, the vast majority of the time when Term 91 is in effect, no water is available for appropriation by either El Dorado or junior appropriators. But the court didn't agree that the majority of time was sufficient. The court stated that the rule of priority protected the water right if there was water available to divert under its permit at any time. And the board had the duty to make that determination and not rely on a rule that was right the majority of the time. We're facing the same thing here. In fact, the court noted that Term 91 was not needed, stating that a water right user does not have the right to take water when no natural or abandoned flows are available. And thus, quote, Term 91 is not necessary in such circumstances to protect against the actual or constructive taking of the project's stored water. Also of import is the court statement that there may be circumstances under which water right holders can continue to divert under the rule of priority, but still take water that could be used to minimize the project's obligation. The court said El Dorado is under no obligation to bypass natural flow needed to meet Delta water quality objectives. And there may be time when natural flow is sufficient to allow El Dorado to divert water and meet the needs of downstream riparians and senior appropriators, but not sufficient to satisfy Delta water quality objectives. In those circumstances, even if the projects had to release additional stored water, the court determined that El Dorado had a right to take that natural flow under the rule of priority, even if the projects are required to release stored water to meet Delta water quality objectives. So the state board would have to do a lot of improvements and changes to Term 91 to allow it to meet the shortcomings outlined by the court case. Finally, the staff proposal is also at odds with the 2012 Delta Water Master Informational Report on Term 91, which characterizes Term 91 as sharing the responsibility for meeting water quality standards with junior diverters, and also discussed that its main purpose is to protect reservoirs burdened with requirements and stop water users downstream from taking stored water. This doesn't currently apply on the San Joaquin River watershed. For these reasons and others that I don't have time to get into at this point, but will make in written comments, the staff should go back to the drawing board and develop a better proposed methodology for addressing dry year considerations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeannie. Okay, so I believe that Danny Merkley is not on the call. So we're going to go ahead and move on to Susan Paulson.
All right. Did I successfully unmute myself here?
Yes, you did.
All right. Super. Thank you. First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in the workshop. These comments are on behalf of BBID, and we believe that decisions regarding curtailments and the methodology used to implement curtailments for Delta water users need to be made in an open and public and transparent forum. So we appreciate this workshop in that spirit. We want to respond specifically to the proposed consideration of what State Board staff have called a Term 91-like approach that they propose could be implemented more broadly in the Delta watershed, including the potential to apply to more senior rights and claims and potentially to replace the water unavailability methodology. To echo what Jeannie Zalesi just said, I also agree that it's useful to understand the history of Term 91. Term 91 was first adopted as an interim solution to require diverters junior to the projects to share responsibility for meeting water quality objectives in the Delta. And Order WRO 81-15 noted in 1981 that the board had begun a comprehensive analysis of the availability of unappropriated water in the Delta watershed, which was scheduled to be completed in January of 1984. And that study wasn't completed. In 1983, the State Board adopted D-1594, which implemented Term 91 on a permanent basis. And Decision 1594 stated that one of the reasons the State Board staff discontinued the comprehensive supply and demand analysis of water availability was the lack of adequate information on return flows in the Delta watershed. And then, as now, the State Board described Term 91 as a simple and accurate method for determining water availability on a real-time basis. And the Term 91 methodology that was proposed by the State Board appears to be the same as the approach described in the November 1999 EIR for the 1995 Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, when the State Board considered but didn't pursue applying Term 91 to certain post-1914 appropriative rights. I also agree with other speakers that the problem with applying Term 91 is that it's too simple, and it's simply not accurate, at least not for the Delta. So Term 91 considers water availability in, quote unquote, real time by evaluating releases from key upstream reservoirs, which are reported daily, or in the case of Oroville, with a 3-day lag. The methodology doesn't explicitly consider the time for those releases to travel downstream in rivers to the Delta, which I agree with Mr. Burke would be sort of a linear, one-directional flow process. And it doesn't consider the time for those releases to travel through the Delta to export points or to the Bay. And that requires, because the Delta is an estuary, that would require consideration of Delta sloshing and travel times. As has been described many times in submittals to the State Board during the current proceedings, during the 2015 to 2016 curtailment proceedings, hydrology in the Delta is complex, and the Delta is a strongly tidal system. In critically dry conditions, Delta residence time is on the order of 2 to 3 months. So the water and availability methodology that we've previously objected to assumes that residence times are less than 1 month, and Appendix D to that methodology states incorrectly that residence times are on the order of 2 to 3 days. In our view, the Term 91 method would make this problem even worse, because it fails to consider both residence time in the Delta and the time required for releases to travel to the Delta. And further, applying a Term 91-like approach to water rights and claims that are more senior to the projects would be inconsistent with the state's priority system as established in prior judicial rulings and noted by others. The good news, I think, is that we really do have tools to address all of this. So, for example, we know that the DSM-2 model works under the full range of hydrologic conditions from wet to critically dry. It is capable of simulating the amount of stored water at any location in the Delta as a function of time. DWR has recently updated DSM-2 to improve its estimates of consumptive use, or DCD, in the Delta, so we can better simulate both diversions and return flows. We have performed and described DSM-2 modeling to the State Board that uses real-time information to track flows in the Delta for the current water year, or for water year 2021. And we used all real-time inputs for that, except for DCD. For DCD, we used a historically similar dry year. So one improvement would be that DCD could be provided or estimated on a real-time basis, and that information could very easily be incorporated in real-time model runs. Second, the state board already tracks the amount of stored water entering the delta. This information was presented in Figure 7 of Appendix D to the water unavailability methodology, and in spreadsheets that state board staff provided to BBID, showing the amount of stored water entering the delta during the summer of 2021. And we understand that the state board has updated those spreadsheets and will provide those soon, but they weren't available prior to this workshop. So really the DSM-2 and the estimates of stored water entering the delta would enable us to describe the distribution and the amount of stored water in the delta as a function of time in near real time, and to do so really accurately. So a methodology, we believe, based on these existing tools would be far superior to the proposed and overly simplistic Term 91 approach. And thus, in conclusion, BBID would encourage the State Water Board to consider resuming and completing in a public stakeholder process with evidentiary hearings, a comprehensive water availability study for the Delta, so that both the board and the regulated community together could develop a sound scientific basis for the important policy decisions that the board members are going to have to make regarding the availability of water and curtailments in the Delta. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, just a reminder to everyone to try your best to stick to the 5-minute time period so that everyone has equal speaking time. We're going to do 2 more speakers and then we'll go ahead and break for lunch. So next up is Gerald Johns. Should get a notification to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think that worked.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay. My name is Jerry Johns, and I'm going to provide probably a little different perspective here than the speakers you've heard so far. First, I'm going to speak as a private citizen here. No one's paying me. I'm a consultant. I've done some consulting work recently for like the last 11 years. But prior to that, I worked at the State Water Resources Control Board for 28 years, was heavily involved in D1485 and the 1978 Water Quality Control Plan and the 1976-77 drought, along with D1594 and the orders that followed that. I spent 10 years at DWR working for the Department of Water Resources, mostly as a deputy director, and the last 11 years have been a consultant on to various water right districts, water districts and irrigation districts. So that totals about 50 years so far. I started the state board when I was 10. I'm just kidding. Anyway, brief overview. I want to be able to provide three major points here. One, a little background on the development of 1594 and Term 91 and the Phase 8 hearings that followed that. Some past assumptions on in-basin obligations to help meet delta flows, and also your Term 91, modified Term 91 method, which we've actually thought about 40 years ago. And I think it's on the right track personally. And there are some huge policy implications that I think you need to consider. In terms of background on Term 91 and D1594, Term 91, I believe, is a very elegant solution to a very complex hydrology in the Bay Delta watershed. It's based on real-time data, it's easy to calculate, and it's equitable. And I'd love to take credit for this, but really it was developed by Larry Molnix and Jerry Cox at DWR and based on the coordinated operations agreement between DWR and the Bureau at the time. We had developed a similar method to your water unavailability analysis back in the day. However, Walt Pettit at the time believed that Term 91 was easier and more accurate, and I believe that Walter was right, as he usually is. D1594 resolve the obligations basically of in-basin users to help meet Delta standards, those users that have Term 80 in them. And that was a major component of that the Water Board decided at the time. And then Phase 8 of the process back then was to look at the obligations of other water right holders that didn't have Term 80 in them and what their obligations might be to help meet Delta standards or bypass natural flows to meet delta water quality and other needs. During that discussion, the board, during the phase 8 process, decided not to follow through with that, relied rather on agreements and some water transfers that took place. And there were no formal actions taken by the board to address this outstanding issue of the obligations of others to help meet delta water quality and water needs. Let's talk a little bit about past assumptions about the obligations of in-basin users to help meet delta's obligations. Like was talked about earlier, D990 talks about this and was used a lot in trying to, in that time, they were trying to figure out what the water right holders in the basin had in terms of water available to them. And in the 1956 studies, they looked at some assumptions about how much water needed to be bypassed by in-basin users in order to determine what water was available for them to develop for their own water rights. And at that time, those studies included something like 1,500 to 2,000 CFS in terms of flows that needed to be bypassed before water was available for other in-basin uses. Also, during the drought in 1977, the Water Board did a water availability analysis during that drought and basically assumed that 2,000 CFS needed to come off the top in terms of natural flow when they decided how much water was then available to meet different water right holders in the basin. The modified term 91 approach, I think, is moving in the right direction. However, it does need to be some modifications. One thing you did kind of gloss over in your discussions is a point that your current modified, your current water availability on water unavailability analysis does not assume any obligation of in-basin users to bypass natural flows that's needed in the delta. Your term 91 approach modified basically assumes that they are responsible for bypassing those natural flows needed to be the delta. That's a huge policy implication. I think most people here are understanding that, but it is a big deal. And I think the board needs to understand that implication. It's something that we try to address during the term 8, the phase 8 proceedings, and we're unable to move that to conclusion. And the fact that the board does it now, it's something we've been thinking about as a water board for like 40 years. So it would be an interesting process for you to do that. In addition, I think it resolves an issue about the obligations of meeting unimpaired flows, for example, for the lower San Joaquin River and for any basin plan amendments you guys might be thinking in the future. By implementing this, you would basically be addressing the unimpaired flow needs of the Bay Delta as it relates to the obligations of in-basin water users. And I think that's a whole lot better than some arbitrary percentage of unimpaired flow. So in conclusion, I think the state board, if it adopts the modified term 91 approach as refined, I personally think it's the right approach, but the state board should also conclude that if it does this, that addresses the obligations of in-basin users to meet delta flow and salinity requirements. And if the state board wants additional flows to meet, say, for example, the lower San Joaquin River objectives or any basin plan amendments you might be considering on the Sacramento River, that you've done that. You basically have successfully addressed the in-basin obligations, users' obligations to meet, to bypass natural flows in the Delta to meet those requirements. Another quick point here, and I know I've run out of time here, but I think it's important to, as you think about in-basin obligations, you need to decide to divide basically those in-basin obligations based on the State Water Project CVP water right priority dates. Many of the CVP priority dates are state filings go back to the 20s. Some of them are later than that. And the in-basin obligations for water rights with dates of priority that are after the State Water Project rights should not be included in the equation for those water rights. However, water rights that are dated prior to that should be. This basically addresses the issue that came up in the EID case that was mentioned earlier by Jeannie Salisi. Anyway, that finishes my comments, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to our last speaker before we break for lunch, and that's going to be Tim Wazewski.
Thank you. Tim Wazewski for the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. Thank you for the opportunity to present comments on this issue. I have one comment and two questions for staff, I suppose. The first comment is that I've heard here today, and I've seen in the technical document, this idea that if supplemental project water is positive, then natural flows might be needed to meet the project's Delta water quality requirements. And therefore, senior water right holders might need to be curtailed to some level that eliminates that supplemental project water. I think Ms. Zalesi identified the problem with that, which is that some of those senior water right holders are entitled to that natural flow. And if you curtail those senior users so that natural flow is now being put towards meeting the project's water quality requirements, you're essentially transferring responsibility for meeting the water quality requirements from the projects to more senior users. And if that's what is being proposed, then we think the proposal is improper. It violates the rule of water right priority, and depending on how it's done, it could violate the due process rights of senior water right holders. So as for the two questions that sort of come out of the technical document that was released the other day, I see sort of two primary components to term 91. There's the form of it, and then there's the function of it. And I have a question sort of related to both of those. The first question is as to the form. It's not clear from the technical document how or whether the board plans to amend water right permits of senior water right holders to include this new term 91 style requirement. So the question we have is the plan to actually amend water right permits to include new terms? And if so, what is the proposed process for that? In addition, is there any plan to address pre-1914 water right holders who do not hold permits or licenses? We think that that type of plan would be problematic on several levels, but we would like to know if the board has that type of plan in mind. The second question sort of goes to the function of term 91, which is essentially to protect project releases from diversion by junior water right holders. And I see in the technical document that there's an effort to expand that approach to reach water right holders that are senior to the projects, including pre-1914 water right holders. So the question here is, has the board identified the legal basis for contravening the rules of water right priority and for exercising jurisdiction over pre-1914 water rights in the type of way that would be needed to put this proposal into effect? Again, we don't think that such a legal basis exists, but we'd like to know if the board disagrees and the legal basis for that disagreement. For these reasons, and I think it's implicit from some of the questions that we're raising, we don't think that the proposed approach is practical or legal. And we'd ask that you keep that in mind for further workshops, if there are any on this. We don't think that this approach is, we don't think that this approach needs to be pursued any further, frankly, until we can see an actual legal basis for it. Thank you for the opportunity to present these comments and questions, and thank you for holding the workshop.
Great, thank you. And with that, that'll wrap up our speakers for now. We still have several more in the list. So we'll go ahead and take a 30-minute break for lunch. We also want to make sure we have some time at the end for some conversation, Q&A back and forth, in which staff will be able to respond to some of these comments. So if you've already spoken, please come back after lunch, as we're going to have more conversation at that time. So we will see you at 12:30 or just after. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully folks have made their way back, enjoyed a relaxing lunchtime, and we're going to dive right back into our speakers. So next up, we're going to have Paul Hutton. Paul, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Awesome. Yes, we can.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Hutton with Tetra Tech, representing the state water contractors. The state water contractors appreciate the Water Board's interest in looking at different ways to protect stored water supplies and to implement curtailments when fresh water supplies are limited. We have 4 comments/questions. First, it is our understanding that the Water Board is proposing that the existing Term 91 would remain in effect, and the Water Board's proposed new Term 91 would be for the more senior water rights, particularly the post-1914 junior appropriators. The state water contractors support pursuing Term 91 as a mechanism for protecting stored water supplies, since it has been successfully implemented for many years. Second, we would appreciate better understanding as to why the Water Board thinks the current Term 91 calculation methodology would need to be modified before it could be applied to more senior water rights. Why couldn't the existing Term 91 methodology be applied to a larger class of water rights? As we understand the Water Board's proposal, the modified methodology could trigger Term 91 less often than the existing calculation, and that could be a concern. Third, Term 91 provides a way to calculate when watershed curtailments would be triggered, but it is not clear to us how subsequent curtailments could be applied to more senior water rights, like senior appropriators and riparians. There would need to be some mechanism for determining when the term gets applied to more senior rights. The Water Board should describe in greater detail how this term would be applied to curtail these and the post-1914 water rights. And then last, regardless of methods, it continues to be our view that curtailments should apply to in-delta users. They should not be the only water rights in the state of California that are under no obligation to conserve or be curtailed. As it relates to in-delta riparians, the Water Board should consider when there is insufficient non-project fresh water to serve all riparians, there should be set up a sharing mechanism. Otherwise, in-delta riparians continue to take full quantities, thereby affecting stored water supplies. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments.
Okay, great. Next up, we're going to have Dan Nomalini. Which I believe is Dan Nomalini Jr., but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Dan Nomalini Jr., also with the Central Delta Water Agency. And I just wanted to offer a few additional comments. We think expanding Term 91 is the worst possible approach you could take. We believe the current implementation of Term 91 is deeply flawed and unlawful, even to water right holders that are deemed junior to the projects. And one of the main reasons is because those water right holders are not junior. The Watershed Protection Act gives them priority to natural flow and abandoned flows over the projects. I mean, period. Term 91 unlawfully reverses that priority. So the proposal to expand it to additional water right holders would take an already unlawful term and exponentially increase the scope of that unlawfulness. It would also require a complete overhaul of D1641. The goal of expanding Term 91 would be to shift the project's obligation to meet Delta standards onto senior water right holders. There were 60 to 80 days of evidentiary hearings to resolve who should be responsible for those standards. I think it was 82 days. And I attended, I believe, every one of those days, and it was torturous and hard to stay awake, but there are a lot of people out there who also attended that. If you want to expand Term 91 and start shifting that responsibility that's already established under D1641, then you're going to need to do some similar approach to overhaul the implementation of the water quality standards. That would be an extensive evidentiary hearing process and also an EIR. In Term 91, expansion was an alternative back in D1641. So I'm not sure how you're contemplating moving forward with something like this, if you were, but you would need to address it in the implementation of the water quality control plan, which we soon will be having a refresh of that implementation. But we believe this expansion would trigger the World War III. People that know about phase 8, this whole thing about who's responsible for what was the can was kicked down the road in the so-called phase 8. Nobody wanted to deal with that. But what you're talking about is hitting that straight on. And as my father and other people explained, when it comes down to who's responsible for salinity control and fishery impacts, the laws are crystal clear that the projects have that burden. It's not debatable. And there's countless promises that my father will quote you or anyone who will listen, where they made promises when they built these reservoirs that they would not do what you're talking about doing. And that is deprive the users in the watershed of the natural flow that's available to them. So beyond the laws that put the burdens for meeting standards for quality and fish on the projects, beyond that, the project's operations have unquestionably caused substantial negative impacts on salinity and fishery needs, from the dams blocking all the pristine spawning grounds for fish, to the massive deliveries to the valley south of the Delta without a valley drain to deal with a tremendous amount of salty drainage that comes into the Delta. The bottom line, this expansion would be a giant unlawful mess, and in our view, the worst possible way to address curtailments. We think it would be dead on arrival and should not be pursued further. But I do have a question that I wanted to ask. I thought I understood Term 91. I spent a lot of time in the past studying it. We in fact litigated it. But in order to expand it, you folks are saying you need to modify it to subtract the project in-basin diversions from supplemental water releases. There's probably an obvious answer to this, but I wanted to ask, so maybe the state board staff could respond to this now or at the end of this workshop. The question is, why aren't those project in-basin diversions already being subtracted from the definition of supplemental water releases? Like I said, it may be an obvious thing, but I'm kind of scratching my head on that. It seems like they should be already subtracted, and I wonder why they're not. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you. And at the end of our speakers list, we will turn it back over to staff for them to respond to a lot of the comments that have been made. So we're taking note of everything and we will address many of your comments and questions. Okay, so I just put in the chat, sorry, ignore that link that I accidentally pasted, but we're gonna have Will Anderson next, followed by Jennifer Spalletta, and then Chris Schuring. So Will, you should get a notification.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
Should be unmuted. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and proceed. And if you have to cut me off because you can't hear me, that's fine. Will Anderson, Water Resources Specialist at Contra Costa Water District. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments on this important issue. The possible curtailment method document identifies potential approaches to developing the necessary data set to make a Term 91 type curtailment method feasible. Generally, we support a Term 91 type of curtailment methodology, which will require incorporation of more comprehensive real-time flow and diversion measurements than has been done in the past. Specifically, we support efforts of the State Water Board to collect real-time diversion data reported daily to allow implementation of approaches 1 and 3 to estimate the in-basin obligation term. Many of the in-basin diverters are already required to report daily diversion data online under the SB 88 measurement regulations. One may ask, what are the hurdles to compiling this information? Perhaps only minor changes are needed to evaluate real-time data by water right and by point of diversion. The projects should not need to be the middleman for these data streams. Furthermore, any real-time data should be understood to be preliminary and subject to review for quality assurance and quality control before any curtailments would be determined. Of course, the devil is in the details. Anticipating the absence of complete enough data, the document raises several other potential approaches to estimate in-basin obligations that are problematic. For one, assessment of depletion between stream flow gauges in approach 2 should not be used to estimate project deliveries because of the potential for large errors to be introduced into the in-basin obligations term. If there were, in fact, significant in-stream depletions that are not due to lawful diversions of either senior water, project water, or settlement contract water, it would be important for staff to assess the true character of such depletions and to adapt the curtailment approach and regulatory posture accordingly. Secondly, as raised in approach 4, delta outflow is not a suitable proxy for in-basin obligations. It's unclear how this would be implemented, so additional detail might be useful. However, since the goal of this methodology is to improve estimates of each quantity and not to rely on estimates that would be inadequate for the purposes of curtailments. Finally, where any future curtailment methodology will be used to curtail water users in the Delta, of course, we still recommend that staff will need to recognize that water use within the tidal delta is a special case, requiring the use of hydrodynamic models to accurately assess mixing and residence time rather than exchange rates as previously proposed in Appendix D. Essentially, this methodology proposal is a move that we generally support toward management with better real-time data and accounting. We look forward to working with State Board staff to support this important initiative. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So it looks like Jennifer Spalletta does not need to speak, so we'll move on to Chris Schuring.
That concludes my comments.
Thank you. It doesn't look like Chris is on the call. So we'll move on to Justin Frederickson.
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, Chris is not on the line, so I'm Justin Frederickson. I'll be commenting on his place for the California Farm Bureau. To start with an understatement, what we're talking about is an area where we see there's a range of diverse and sometimes sharply diverging views, and those are perspectives that divide different portions of our state. Overall, I think those are issues for the interested parties to duke out, and for the board, and if necessary, the courts to sort out. But for that, they need to have an opportunity to duke it out, and there also needs to be a proper sorting out of those disputes. And that was always previously done in the setting of a full-blown evidentiary water rates proceeding. Just go back to D1485, D1641, the one dealing with the Term 91 itself. Those were all water rates proceedings. What's being proposed here is not a water rates proceeding. Properly undertaken, this is hard work and a multi-step long-term proposition. The current drought is an emergency and has necessitated some temporary emergency measures. That, however, does not justify shortcutting proper process in normal times over the long term. The proposed Term 91 approach, which is heavily assumption laden and incomplete in many places, is too quick to suggest we have perfect, undisputed information we do not have, and not large gaps and uncertainties such as we know to exist. Another issue here, whereas Term 91 deals with post-project rights, this is different from pre-project permitted and licensed rights, and very different from pre-1914 and riparian rights, over which the board has no direct permitting authority and therefore no actual Term 91-like ability to directly amend or condition the underlying right. The board's emergency curtailment process of this in the last drought has itself been unprecedented, and in quite a transparent and collaborative manner. To its credit, the board has acknowledged its curtailment methodology is still an imperfect work in progress. Emergency curtailments are a stopgap measure that has improved over time, but still not a license to brush senior water rights claims and classes of users aside, bypassing the normal adjudicative process for such a far-reaching step. To be clear, we do need our water rights system to work. We do need tools to cope with drought emergencies. We do need to protect rights to previously stored water. We do need to prevent taking of water if and where there is no right to take it, though that question is by no means clear in all cases. And we do need to properly sort through equitable sharing of regulatory burdens. Again, not a simple question. In a complex system, though, we must also not take competing claims and especially very senior pre-existing historic claims lightly. The board has quasi-adjudicative authorities and quasi-legislative authorities. The ease and convenience of a quasi-legislative sword does not justify an abdication of the board's quasi-judicial role where required, or an abdication of the board's obligation to continue to work in parallel toward nuanced refinement of an adaptive functional approach in the interim. Improvements in available methodologies have been made and can be further refined and continuously refined in a transparent manner as needs, circumstances, and evolving knowledge warrant. At the same time, it may be that closer court direction or more thorough water rights proceeding examination of the board's current water availability methodologies themselves may be warranted. Since this methodology done in haste during drought by default then becomes the template and starting point for future curtailments. And of course, at some point, we may also need more fundamentally and definitively to deal head on with longstanding unresolved disputes and uncertainties, again, through appropriate proceedings. In closing, thank you. In the meantime, however, it seems there is some fairly broad consensus in public comments today, at least on this. Shortcutting and too hastily leapfrogging ahead through one simple mechanism, though a tempting thought, is not, in fact, a quick answer to the longstanding problems that continue to plague us and that will continue to require our continued attention and diligence for many a year to come. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And that's going to conclude our public comment period, as Nick Bonsignore was the last person on our speakers list, and he indicated that he does not want to speak. So if you want to provide public comment, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can ask you to unmute yourself. But at this time, we'll turn it back over to staff so that they can respond to some of the points that were made. So thank you very much to everyone who took the time to bring your comments today.
Thanks, Molly. This is Diane Riddle. I'll go ahead and start us off. And I also want to thank everyone for sharing your viewpoints today. It's really helpful to us, and kind of reiterate that this is the beginning of any planning process related to our actions next year. There's no specific proposal on the table. And, we went out with this workshop was intended to inform, is this a viable concept? Does this concept make sense in terms of something we should be evaluating next year? There's nothing specifically on the table now. If there were, however, the concept would potentially be replacing the water unavailability methodology with a Term 91-like approach, using it in combination, something like that. We don't have, again, any specific proposals developed yet, but to address some of the process-related questions, it could look very similar in terms of process to the process that was undertaken for the existing curtailment and reporting regulation that's in place now. Granted, we understand, there are strong feelings on different sides of this equation, and there would, of course, also be a public process involved in any proposal related to any such emergency regulation. I also wanted to note that really the concept is at this point is being evaluated from the perspective of addressing if we have continued dry conditions next year, would this be an appropriate approach for us to take? And, if conditions were dry enough that there was inadequate supply to meet water quality standards and maintain adequate storage for health and safety and providing for salinity control at times when natural and abandoned flows are unavailable. So it is we do acknowledge that it is a more significant type of curtailment than the existing methodology that is looking at water availability, managing that down to zero available supplies. This methodology would protect the supply, the natural and abandoned flows needed to meet in-stream flow requirements. We understand that's a significant step. And again, that's one of the reasons we're exploring this concept in a conceptual way with you all before we move forward with any specific proposals. And we are very happy to receive the feedback that we got today on that concept, and are also happy to receive additional public comments that stakeholders might like to submit to our Bay Delta email box. We don't have a particular comment period because we don't have a particular proposal out there at this point, but if we could, I did hear some parties request a deadline for comments. If we could get comments by the within a month or so, maybe that would be helpful. The sooner we get comments, the sooner those comments are informative to our planning processes. Obviously, we're also looking at hydrologic conditions, and those are changing as the water year progresses, and all of those things we have to take into consideration. So we appreciate the early feedback on this possible approach and any additional feedback the parties would like to provide in writing. And again, there will be additional processes to come if this is a concept that we develop and plan to move forward with. From that perspective, I also wanted to respond to, we got some questions in writing in addition to the verbal questions that we got here today on how a Term 91 type approach would interact with other processes. That would depend upon if and when we move forward with a Term 91 type approach. How it would interact, and that would be something we'd have to address. Longer term processes like the implementation of the Bay Delta plan, that I think would be a separate consideration, a long-term consideration of a Term 91 type approach, not this emergency type action that could be considered to address the immediate water supply shortages that may result from drought circumstances. So just wanted to provide that clarification. The other thing I wanted to note is there were a lot of comments raised, and we're not planning at this point to respond necessarily point by point and address every comment. We are going to try to catch the big ones. Again, I think the appropriate forum to address really detailed questions and comments, and particularly a lot of the legal comments and questions, is if there is a specific proposal that's brought forward. However, there are just some big picture legal issues that we would like to address. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Dana Heinrich in our Office of Chief Counsel, and she can elaborate on some of that a little bit more.
Thanks, Diane. There's actually only one of the comments of a legal nature that I wanted to respond to here. Like Diane was saying, we heard a lot of comments of a legal nature, and I don't think this is the right forum to be responding point by point to those arguments. A lot of them overlap with or duplicate arguments that some of the diverters are raising in petitions for reconsideration of the curtailment orders. And so there's a separate process for responding to those legal arguments, and this is not the right forum. But I did want to respond to at least one commenter, maybe more, talked about the El Dorado decision. And I am very familiar with that decision, having been the State Water Board staff attorney assigned to that case. And in my view, that case did not in any way call into question the validity of Term 91 as a method for determining water availability on a real-time basis. The court did invalidate the inclusion of Term 91 in El Dorado's permit, which had a 1927 priority date, because the board had not included the same term in junior permits with junior priority dates. In my view, if Term 91 were included in a group of permits and implemented in order of priority, that would be legally entirely consistent with the holding in the El Dorado case. So I just wanted to respond to that one comment about that case. Otherwise, I didn't want to elaborate on any of the other legal arguments at this time.
Thanks, Dana. With that, I think we can now turn it over to Matt Holland, who will respond to some of the technical comments that we received today.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so we received a number of technical questions and comments in both in writing and in the course of the public comments. So I'm going to try to synthesize them into themes that cover the major things that I heard, and hopefully I will address everything satisfactorily. So one question that came up was, what impact would a methodology like an expansion of Term 91 have on stored water? And the answer is that it would not result in any non-project user having to release previously stored water to satisfy a curtailment under this methodology, or to contribute to meeting water quality standards. What it would do is it would require, in order of priority, a user who may be diverting to storage or diverting directly to bypass that flow if the curtailment implicates that order of priority. So it would have, to the degree that, depending on the magnitude of the supplemental project water that was being provided by the projects and the degree of compliance with curtailments, it would improve project storage, in that it would lead to a lower need to release previously stored project water, but it would not cause any other diverter to release previously stored water. And another theme that arose was, as Dana just referred to in the legal context, the order of priority. That's, and from a technical perspective, this would be implemented in priority order, so that the most junior water rights would be curtailed first, followed, going, to the more senior rights as needed to eliminate the supplemental project water defined in terms of this expanded methodology. Another question that came up was, would such a method change the existing implementation of Term 91 for water right holders who have Term 91 in their rights? It would not. That calculation would remain as it is. It's only an application to other water right users that the modifications would be needed. And of course, those users would be curtailed before any curtailments kicked in for more senior users, just by the design of the methodology. Another question that came up is, how would settlement contractors be affected by a methodology like this? Essentially, with regard to their own rights, they would be treated like any other user would be treated by this. They just generally have more senior rights, so they would be later in getting curtailed than other users. However, they would, provided that the projects are still able to serve them previously stored water, they would, be able to continue receiving project deliveries. Additionally, another effect that we might see is that given that we'd be curtailing down to the natural and abandoned flows needed to meet water quality objectives rather than down to zero, curtailments would generally be likely to go into effect earlier and cut a little deeper. And there was a question about how the method would differ from the current methodology, and I think that kind of covers it, at least qualitatively. Some other questions that came up, or a comment that was made, was that the existing term 91 calculation does not account for travel time from the upstream reservoirs to the delta. It does, at least approximately. It uses integer day time lags for the various reservoirs. So I just wanted to provide that clarification. And then another question that we received was, why is it necessary to add an in-basin obligation term instead of applying the existing methodology broadly to all water rights? Sorry, when I say existing methodology in that context, I mean the existing term 91, not the existing water unavailability methodology implemented by the emergency regulations. So the reason is that fundamentally, the projects should not be able to cause curtailment of another water right holder by releasing previously stored water to serve one of their in-basin contractors. So what this does is it accounts for the water that's being released from project storage and assigns that to project purposes, and only curtails when beyond those in-basin and export project obligations, the projects are releasing previously stored water to meet water quality. Bear with me a moment while I review further questions. Let's see. Oh, and then I think the last question was, why are in-basin deliveries by the projects not included in the term 91 calculation as it currently exists? The most basic answer is simply D1594 adopts the calculation as described in Water Right Order 8115, and that calculation does not include an explicit term for in-basin deliveries of project water. And I think that covers the themes that we heard about on project, or sorry, on a term 91 like method. So I think I can give it back to Diane if she's still on, to see if she has any further questions that I missed.
I think you covered it, Matt. Thank you very much. I think we can move on to Scott Laguerre, who can respond to some of the questions we had on the existing methodology that came up in today's workshop.
Hello. I just wanted to address a few things that came up related to the Appendix D analysis in our existing methodology. The first was that a comment that the existing methodology does not include tributaries to the delta in the analysis, and I just wanted to point out that it actually does. The delta inflow for the water balance in Appendix D is based on reclamation spreadsheet for the calculation of the NDOI, which includes like delta east side tributaries, yellow bypass, at least to the extent that those tributaries have gauged information, those are included. The next one was that the gross channel depletions estimate used in the day flow, the comment was that it didn't include return flows within the delta, and I just wanted to point out that they actually do include return flows. The difference between the net channel depletions and the gross channel depletions is the precipitation, which in the summertime months, which the analysis was done, the precipitation is negligible. So those two are essentially the same. And just the last thing is that there seemed to be a question about an update to the spreadsheet, and that just wasn't clear to me. So I guess if there's any questions on the Appendix D analysis or the spreadsheet, I guess I just request that anybody just reach out to me and I'll be happy to clarify any other things. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. I think that completes the staff responses to the comments that we heard today. Of course, again, we welcome additional written comments over the next month or so with additional feedback that stakeholders would like the board to consider as it undertakes its planning for next year in the event of dry conditions. But with that, I think that concludes the remarks of staff, unless there are any other last minute follow-up issues from anyone.
All right, if we could get the final slides up, that'd be awesome. Great, thanks, Kian. Okay, so thanks again to everyone today for all of your meaningful input. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We wanted to remind everyone that we have many resources available and there are multiple ways to contact us and stay informed. So if you have any questions, please send an email again to the same email address, bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov, or you can call the Delta Drought line at 916-319-0960. Staff monitor the email inbox and the hotline, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. We also encourage you to subscribe to the Delta Drought email list if you haven't already. I imagine many of you probably have, to receive important information regarding drought in the Delta watershed. And to sign up, just go ahead back to the Delta Drought page at waterboards.ca.gov/drought/delta, and you can provide your email there in the email subscription list. And the staff will be updating the Delta Drought webpage as they have been continuously, as well as the water unavailability methodology page with current information. So we strongly encourage everyone to go back and check those websites frequently. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up our workshop for today. And as we mentioned before, we'll have the recording of today's workshop available on the Delta Drought page as soon as possible after we wrap up. So again, we really appreciate your time today and thank you.